Because my fabric is a knit, which means that it's stretchy, I want to maintain this stretch that it has to it. So when I'm pulling on my pants, I don't rip the thread out because the fabric is stretching. So in order to do that, we need to either sew with a zigzag stitch or a stretch stitch. You have a stretch stitch on your machine. It's stitch 10. I don't really like this stitch because it moves the needle too far over, so that when we sew at 5/8, your seam allowance is actually a little bit bigger than 5/8, making your pants smaller. So instead of, you can use a stretch stitch if you want to. Instead of using the stretch stitch, I'm going to use a zigzag stitch, but I am going to shorten the zigzag width. So to do that, I'm going to use stitch 11, and then to shorten the width, I'm just going to change the width button to around 2.0 and the length button to 2.5. This is just going to allow me, if I do make a mistake, it'll be a little bit easier to seam rip with these settings than the 1.5 stitch length and the wider stitch width. So now I'm ready to sew. So keeping my fabric lined up on the 5/8 inch mark on the needle plate, you are going to sew each inseam of your pants. When you get started, don't forget that you need to backstitch every time you start and every time you stop sewing. So when we put this under there, I just aligned my edges a little bit more, keeping the edge at 5/8. And then where you don't have it pinned, like maybe I should have used another pin because my edges aren't exactly lined up, just try and readjust it and then hold it together as you're feeding it through the machine, or if you need to, put another pin in so that they stay together. So take a couple. Okay, for some reason, it could be that I need to change my needle. My machine did not like doing that zigzag stitch on this fabric. So after a couple tries and rethreading, I went ahead and switched to the stretch stitch, which seemed to work a little bit better. So just see what works on your machine and with your fabric. If the stretch stitch works fine, that's okay too. So we have one leg sewn. Now we're gonna go ahead and sew the other leg. Now that we're done with both legs, we are going to seam finish. So what the seam finish is gonna do, you can obviously see that this knit is not gonna unravel, but in this case, I want you to get into the habit of seam finishing every seam. So in order to seam finish, we're gonna keep it in the seam allowance. You can choose stitch 13 or stitch 16, whatever seam finishing technique you wanna use, and then you're gonna go right along the edge of the fabric. This time, lining up my fabric with the edge of my presser foot. I have one leg seam finished. I ended up switching to a stretch needle. It works way better with my fabric. I was trying to maybe use a shortcut by not switching the needle, but the stretch needle really helped a lot with the thread staying in the fabric and not coming out of the needle. So once I switched to the stretch needle, you can see I have my seam and then my seam finish. So now I'm gonna do the other leg. To eliminate bulk in our seams when we're wearing our clothing, we trim our seam allowance. So what you're gonna do is take your scissors and you are going to snip off the little edge of fabric right on the other side of our seam allowance, trying not to cut through your stitching, but just right next to it. Step 2 tells us with right sides together, pin the center seam matching inner leg seams and notches. Stitch. To reinforce seam, stitch again over first stitching. So we're gonna do our seam finish here. So let's take a look at the first set of directions in step 2 with right sides together. So what we're gonna do is we are gonna open up each leg that we just have sewn. You can see the previous seam that we have sewn here in the picture. Take one leg and open it up so that it's right side up. take your other leg and open it up so that it's right side down. So you have the printed side of the fabric together. Now you're gonna match up as the directions say. So it says with right sides together, we did that part. Pin center seam. So what you're looking for is you're laying the seam from this leg directly on top of the seam from this leg. This helps if you have your seams pressed in opposite directions. So I have this one going towards this side, and then this one is going towards the opposite side, so that I can lay these directly on top of each other. So I'm lining up my seams, putting one inside of the other one, and matching it up and laying it down. Then what you can do is, since we sew at 5/8, put a pin in at 5/8 and on your seam. So about 5/8 down from the top, because I'm going to be sewing here, poke it through. If your seams are lined up, it should match through on this side. See how mine is slightly off here? My pin doesn't poke through my seam. So that means that my inner seams probably aren't lined up. So peel it back up. Yep, they got a little bit off. Make sure that your seams are matching on top of each other, laying on top of each other. Poke it in at 5/8 where we'll be sewing. We want that part to match. Once you get your seams matched up, you're ready to pin the rest of the U. So this seam is the one that runs in between your legs, basically from your belly button to your butt crack. So unfold the rest of your fabric, okay, and we're gonna use both our notches on our front, so our single notches, or our double notches, I'm sorry, and then our triple notches on the back will all be matched up. And this should be laying relatively flat because you do have 2 backs and 2 fronts. So everything else should pretty much match up. If it doesn't, or if you're having a hard time matching up this part, it could be that you didn't sew your seams exactly at 5/8. So you may need to go back and check that if you're having a hard time matching this up. But it should be pretty close to being exact with the piece underneath it. So matching up our edges, just like we did before, matching up our notches, and pinning so that the edges of our fabric stay together. So we just pinned the fronts together, and now we're gonna pin the backs together. Just on this inner U part, we're not doing anything with our sides. And now we're gonna stitch from the back or from the front, it doesn't matter. I like to start from the back because then again, you're using that 5/8 and you're going down, around, over your seam, and then back up the other side and back stitching at the top. So you'll have one big U seam. Just like we did with our box corners, we want to make sure that our seams match up. So open up your legs to the outside of your fabric and check to make sure that your seams are intersecting right across from each other. So mine do. You can flip it back over, and now you're going to seam finish that entire U to reinforce your stitching. Once you're done with the seam finish, you're gonna go in with your scissors and trim off that extra seam allowance to eliminate bulk.